You are not a witch. You know this. Your neighbors know this. You have spent 30 years healing the sick, delivering babies, and keeping your mouth shut when powerful men did things that deserve to be spoken about. Then someone's cow dies. Then a child gets sick. Then the harvest fails. And suddenly the thing that made you useful, the knowledge, the independence, the fact that you lived outside the normal structures of village life, becomes the thing that gets you killed. This is not a story about superstition. It is not a story about ignorance. It is a story about land, money, power, and what happens when communities need someone to blame and institutions need someone to burn. The witch trials were real. The reasons behind them were not what you were taught. Between 1450 and 1750, somewhere between 40,000 and 60,000 people were executed for witchcraft across Europe. Around 80% of them were women. But here is the first thing that should stop you cold. The Spanish Inquisition, the institution that everyone associates with religious persecution, executed almost nobody for witchcraft. Spain and Italy, the heart of Catholic power in Europe, had some of the lowest execution rates on the continent. The places with the most executions were not the most religiously intense. They were the most politically fragmented, the most economically unstable, and the most legally chaotic. If this was about religious fanaticism, that makes no sense. So what was it actually about? Look at who got accused, and the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. She was usually older, often a widow, frequently living alone. Sometimes she had property, sometimes she had a reputation for healing. Sometimes she had simply argued with the wrong neighbor at the wrong time. What she almost never was, powerful. What she almost always was, in someone's way. In documented cases across Germany, France, and England, historians have traced the timing of accusations to property disputes. A widow who had recently inherited land, an elderly woman whose heirs were impatient, a neighbor whose removal would solve a boundary problem that had been festering for years. The witch trial did not just punish the accused. In most jurisdictions, it also seized her property. Think about that. A legal mechanism that allowed you to accuse someone, have them executed, and take everything they owned, and dress it up as a religious duty. Who built that system, and why? Here is something your history teacher probably did not tell you. For most of the medieval period, the official position of the Catholic Church on witchcraft was, it does not exist. A 10th century document called the Canon Episcopi declared that the belief in night flights and demonic pacts was a delusion. The church's position was that women who claimed to fly through the night were not witches. They were confused. So what changed? In 1486, two Dominican inquisitors published a book called the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches. It argued that witchcraft was real, that women were especially vulnerable to it, and that the proper response was prosecution and execution. It reversed 800 years of official skepticism in a single volume. The book was controversial. Many church authorities rejected it outright. But it was also one of the first books printed on Gutenberg's new printing press. Within decades, it had gone through multiple editions and was in the hands of magistrates and local officials across Europe. The printing press did not just spread the Bible, it spread the instruction manual everywhere. This is the part that surprises almost everyone. The Protestant Reformation is usually taught as a liberalizing force, a break from Catholic superstition, a move toward reason and individual conscience. In terms of witch trials, it made things significantly worse. Before the Reformation, Europe had one dominant religious authority. After it, Catholic and Protestant communities existed in direct competition, geographically, politically, and spiritually. Each side needed to prove its godliness. Each side needed to demonstrate that it took spiritual threats seriously. Witch trials became a performance of religious purity. The competition between Catholic and Protestant communities to appear more pious created a ratchet. Neither side could afford to appear soft. The areas with the most executions were almost always areas of religious conflict, not the most devout areas, the most contested ones. The trials were not a symptom of too much religion. They were a symptom of two religions fighting for survival. Running parallel to the religious conflict was something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with God or the devil. The climate was changing. From roughly 1300 to 1850, Europe experienced a sustained cooling period that historians call the Little Ice Age. Harvests failed. Winters were brutal. Food prices rose. Communities that had been marginally stable became desperate. Desperate communities need explanations. A failed harvest is not an acceptable answer on its own. Someone must be responsible. The theology of witchcraft provided exactly the framework a starving village needed. The harvest failed because someone made a pact with the devil. Find that person, remove them, and prosperity will return. Historians have now mapped witch trial panics against harvest data across multiple countries. The correlation is striking. When crops failed, accusations surged. When harvests recovered, accusations fell. The witch trials track the weather, not the scripture, the weather. The question that should be asked more often is not why people believed in witches. It is why the accused were overwhelmingly female. Women in early modern Europe had enough social presence to be visible and enough legal vulnerability to be attackable. A man with property had mechanisms to defend himself, legal standing, social networks, the ability to mount a credible counter-accusation. A widow living alone had almost none of these. Midwives and healers were especially targeted. They had knowledge that was difficult to explain. They were present at moments of birth and death when things went wrong. They operated outside male institutional control. Everything that made them valuable to their communities made them useful targets when those communities needed someone to blame. The Malleus Maleficarum provided the theological justification. But the theology came after the motive, not before. The witch trials did not end because people stopped believing in witchcraft. They ended because the legal standards for evidence changed. As long as courts accepted spectral evidence, testimony that the accused had appeared in someone's dream, or that an invisible force had caused harm, conviction was easy and acquittal nearly impossible. When courts began requiring physical evidence of actual harm, convictions became nearly impossible. This change was not driven by religious reform. It was driven by lawyers and magistrates who were uncomfortable with the evidentiary standards being applied. What stopped the witch trials was not enlightenment about the supernatural. It was a procedural argument about what counts as proof. The witch trial era lasted 300 years. It killed tens of thousands of people, and it was not driven primarily by irrational superstition. It was driven by land disputes, climate crises, religious competition, and legal systems that gave powerful people a mechanism to destroy vulnerable ones while calling it justice. The accused were not random. They were selected by systems of property, gender, and power, that identified the most vulnerable people in a community and provided a socially acceptable way to eliminate them. Calling it superstition lets those systems off the hook. The people who ran the trials were not crazy. They were rational actors responding to real pressures with the tools their society gave them. The tool just happened to be burning women alive. That is the part that should make you uncomfortable. Not that people in the past believed in witches, but that the machinery that destroyed those women was built from entirely ordinary materials. It just needed a name for what it was doing. Witchcraft worked fine.